I'm always encouraged to see people who are interested in the issue of Palestine, whether it's here in Europe or whether it's in North America or whether it's in other places. I've been to New Zealand and Malaysia, all kinds of places, and it's very encouraging to see people that care and want to see change, because that's how change happens, when people care and participate and listen and learn and so on. That's how change happens. If we think of other examples where people demanded change, like in South Africa, for example, when people demanded change, the end of apartheid, and other racist regimes around the world, people spoke and people acted around the world, and that's how change took place. So it's always encouraging to see that. One of the things that's interesting about this issue, about the Israeli-Palestinian issue, is that there's so much confusion about it. There's so many different versions of the story, so many different versions of the history. You read one book, it says this. You read another book, it says something else. You go to one lecture, they say this. You go to another lecture, they say something else. And how do you figure out what's true? But there are a few issues that make it very confusing. For example, when we talk about Zionism, the ideology that started the State of Israel, the ideology that created the State of Israel. So this ideology came about 100, 120 years ago, and the claim that they made was that all Jewish people in the world today are the descendants of the ancient Hebrews, and the ancient Hebrews lived in that part of the world 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. And then they said that in the modern era, because Jewish people are suffering from persecution in Europe, they all have a right to return to the land of Israel. So that's a very interesting claim to begin with. But the term that they used, and is still being used today, is the return. So 100 years ago, they had to convince people that this was a good idea. Today, it's taken for granted. Everybody talks about the Jewish people have a right to return. So somebody who is Jewish, who lives in Luxembourg and maybe was born here, they have a right to one day, they or their children, if they want to go live in Israel, they have a right to do that. But what's confusing even more is that when we talk about the right of return of Palestinians, now suddenly everything changes. When we talk about, or if you bring up the right of return of the Palestinians, then people say, no, we can't do that. We can't even talk about this. The Palestinians need to forget. This is too complicated. We need to look forward. We need to forget the past. So we have, on the one side, we have people, the Zionists, saying they have a right, Jewish people have a right to return because of something that happened 2,000 years ago, even though there aren't any Jewish people that can trace their roots back to the ancient Hebrews. So that's okay for 2,000 years ago. But with Palestinians, they have to forget, even though there are still Palestinians who remember the day they had to leave, and they still have the key to their home, and they have the deed to their land. They have to forget. So the people who have a claim it's from 2,000 years ago are telling people who are still alive and remember the day that they had to leave that they have to forget, and that their claim is too old. And this is how the conversation, this is how the discourse on the Palestine issue takes place. This has become a normal part of the conversation. And you have to wonder, how does that make sense? And then another claim that is often made, and I'm sure you hear this a lot, is that criticizing is the state of Israel, or criticizing Zionism, is anti-Semitic. So if you criticize Israel, you're anti-Semitic, which means you're racist. Now, this is a very strange claim for several reasons. First of all, most Jewish people don't live in Israel. Many Jewish people always opposed Israel. Many Jewish people rejected Zionism. So are they also anti-Semitic? What about those Jewish people? That's number one. Number two, so opposing Israel is anti-Semitic and racist. In fact, they're saying this more and more today. So what does it mean when you support Israel? Is there a name for that? Because if we support Israel, we support a state that has thousands of political prisoners. If we support Israel, we support a state that has laws that discriminate against the non-Jews. If we support Israel, we support a state that gives less water to Palestinians because they're not Jewish. If we support Israel, we support a state that on a regular basis, as a policy, kills civilians, Palestinian civilians, not by mistake, not as collateral damage, but as a policy. So opposing all of that is anti-Semitic, and supporting all of that is okay? How does that even make sense? How is supporting all of that okay? This is supposed to help the Jews? This is supposed to help anyone? So it's very threatening for people to criticize Israel, for many people, because they don't want to be called anti-Semitic. But on the other hand, the whole claim that it's anti-Semitic is completely absurd. Because criticizing Israel is the right thing to do. Criticizing any racist regime is the right thing to do, regardless if they're Jewish or Muslim or Christian or anything else. But they've created this impression, and now they say it even more. They bring in this whole anti-Semitic claim even more. Now, another thing that's often said is, well, the conflict has been going on for centuries. This has been going on for thousands of years. So there's really nothing we can do. And that's a very dangerous thing to say, because it tells people that they have no power. They have no power to change things. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict was created by people. It's not a typhoon. It's not a tsunami. And people are the way it's going to change. People are going to change it. So if we tell people to sit down and do nothing because it's hopeless, because it's been going on forever, that's a very dangerous thing. Besides being not true. It hasn't been going on for centuries. It hasn't been going on for thousands of years. And in fact, if we want to talk about the beginning of the conflict, then a good time to start talking about it historically is the 29th of November, 1947. That's when the United Nations decided to partition Palestine. And this is a map of Palestine. So they decided to partition Palestine and give a portion to the Jews for a Jewish state and a portion to the Palestinian Arabs for an Arab state. Now, I think it's important to make it absolutely clear. Some people think that there's a Palestine and there's an Israel, and they don't get along. Palestine and Israel is the same place. This is the same place. It has two names. Now, in 1947, you had the Jewish community there, you had a Palestinian Arab community, and of course the United Nations wanted to make it simple. They said, we'll give these people a state, we give these people a state, and everybody will be happy. And it's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but it made sense in a very simplistic way. Because when we look at the details, we see that in 1947, there are only about 500,000 Jewish people living in Palestine. There were close to 1.5 million Palestinian Arabs living in Palestine. So when United Nations partitioned the land, or came up with this partition plan, they gave the larger portion of the country to the smaller community. The larger portion of the country they designated for the Jewish state, even though the Jewish community was much smaller. And the smaller portion of the country to the Arab Palestinian state. And I don't know who thought it made sense, or I don't know who thought this was going to work. And what's absurd is that even today, when people talk about this, they say, this whole conflict is really the Palestinians' fault, because they rejected this plan. Now, nobody asked the Palestinians if they accepted it or rejected it, but the point is, why shouldn't they reject it? Who wouldn't reject a crazy plan like this? That the United Nations would cut off the large portion of their country, give it to a community of immigrants who really just came off the boat. The Jewish community in Palestine at the time were the generation of my grandparents who immigrated, and then my parents' generation who was born there. And then from this point on, exactly from this point on in history, we have two opposing histories. which is what makes it confusing. People always try to look for balance, to be good to both sides. But when you have two opposing histories, then you can't have a balance because they're opposing. Only one of them can be true, which makes it even more confusing. So the story that I learned growing up, and the story that people generally learn in the West, is that after the Arabs rejected this plan, they began an attack against the Jewish community because they wanted to kill and destroy the Jews. And then the war ensued. The war went on for about 12 months, and at the end of the war, the Jewish community, because they were stronger and smarter and better and well prepared and so on, were able to defeat the Arabs and establish the state of Israel, the Jewish state, once again on the land of Israel after 2,000 years. This is a pretty powerful story. This is a pretty heroic and romantic story. I mean, why would anybody argue with a story like this? It's a perfect story. Once again, the descendants of King David who defeated Goliath and the descendants of the Maccabees who defeated great empires are back, and now they defeated the Arabs. This is an excellent story. And again, the problem is with the details. Because when we look at the two communities in 1947, it's true they were both expecting to be states and they all began developing institutions of state. But there was one thing that the Zionist community developed very heavily that the Palestinian Arab community didn't. And it's very simple. It was an armed militia, a fighting force. By 1947, the Zionist militia numbered close to 40,000 well-trained armed men. My father was an officer in that militia. There was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. There was no armed Palestinian militia. In fact, there's never been a Palestinian army. So if this is true, who attacked the Jews in 1947? If there was no Palestinian militia, if there was no armed force, who attacked the Jewish community? And who was it that was trying to destroy and kill the Jews? We know that other Arab countries intervened in Palestine later. That was 6-7 months later, after this has already been going on, the fighting had been going on. But who attacked the Jews in 1947 if there was no Palestinian militia? Nobody did. It was the other way around. After the United Nations gave their stamp of approval to the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, the Zionist militia began a massive campaign that today would be called terrorism and ethnic cleansing. And this attack, terrorist attack, lasted 12 months. It was 12 months of an armed militia terrorizing a civilian population with the intention of completing the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. By the end of 12 months, by the end of 1948, they managed to conquer almost 80% of the country. They destroyed hundreds and hundreds of cities and towns, Palestinian cities and towns, and they forced into exile close to 1 million Palestinians. Now the story is not so heroic, it's not so romantic, it's not so biblical, but now the story fits. The pieces fit the puzzle. We had an armed militia and an unarmed civilian population, and that's why it worked. And that's why they were able to do what they were able to do. Now, quite often we hear the claim that, well, perhaps, the Zionists kicked out a few people, perhaps they destroyed a few towns, but really there was nothing there. Really, when the Jews came, when the Zionists came to Palestine, they brought progress and they brought the economy and they really brought everything. There was nothing there before the Zionists came, which is an interesting claim. This is a picture of the city of Jaffa before 1948. So today I learned that the city of Luxembourg has about 100,000 people. The city of Jaffa had about 120,000 people. This is before 1948. And that boulevard, by the way, is still there, that boulevard in Jaffa. It was a city that had commerce, that had trade unions, that had theaters, that had concert halls. Several newspapers were printed in Jaffa. They had a rich business life, a rich political life. And this city this very important Arab city on the Mediterranean, within 2 weeks in 1948, it was reduced to less than 4,000 people concentrated in one neighborhood with barbed wires and Israeli guards watching over them. And I think this is important to remember because quite often people try to reduce Palestine to the West Bank and Gaza. Palestine is not the West Bank and Gaza. Palestine is the entire country. The problems that Palestinians face, they face everywhere. Whether they are in Jaffa, whether they're in the West Bank, whether they're in the Galilee, regardless. Now, on the ashes of the city of Jaffa, which was a major Arab city, now sits the city of Tel Aviv, and this picture is almost from the exact same angle. The modern Israeli city of Tel Aviv. And Jaffa was an Arab city with a small Jewish neighborhood. Tel Aviv is an Israeli city with a small, oppressed, and neglected, and segregated Palestinian community. And when people say, well, we need to forget because this was in the past, it's an interesting claim, but it's not something you can do because that has not been remedied yet. We can't ask people to forget the past when the past hasn't been remedied, when the process still goes on. And one of the problems is that as a result of this campaign of terrorizing and ethnic cleansing, today there are over 4 million Palestinians living in refugee camps. I took this picture in January. Now, I don't think you have to say anything to describe this picture. People living without running water, without sewage system, without electricity, without access to basic medical care, and without proper nutrition. Never mind without rights, without the ability to work. Now, this is not in some remote mountaintop in Afghanistan. This is an hour, maybe 2 hours drive at the most from major cities in Israel, in what used to be Palestine. Why would these children not have access to medical care when they're maybe an hour's drive from major hospitals inside Israel? Why are they not connected to water? Why do they have no electricity? Why do they not have access to things that an hour drive from where they live are taken for granted? You're not going to see Israeli children live like this anywhere. The only reason these children are like this is because they are Palestinians, and what is important to remember in this context is that what took place in 1948, the catastrophe, what the Palestinians call the Nakba, didn't just happen in 1948. It began in 1948. It's continuing today. In fact, in many ways, it's even worse today than it was in 1948, and we are allowing it to happen. Because when we support the state of Israel, we are allowing this to go on. It's inexcusable, it's unjustifiable, besides being reprehensible. And we are allowing this to continue under our watch every single day. And again, this is an hour's drive, maybe an hour and a half drive, not even flight, just drive from the very places where these children's grandparents were thrown out. There is no excuse, there is no justification to this. And we can't ask people to forget the past when the past is still taking place. The process didn't end. The process of the ethnic cleansing and the terrorizing of Palestinians still goes on. And so we can't really ask them to forget the past and move on. Now, some of you saw that I have the book outside. When I was working on the book, I did two things. I gathered information about the conflict, but I also talked about it. It's a memoir. It's a story of my family, and my family was very heavily involved with the creation of the State of Israel. My grandfather on my mother's side was an important Zionist leader. He would travel around the world. He would talk to communities about the need to support the idea of Zionism. He's a signer on the Israeli Declaration of Independence. My father was an officer in 1948. He later on became a general. And there's a story that my mother told me when I was growing up, and she told it to me many, many times. This is a picture of my mother when she was about 22. And she was born and raised in Jerusalem. In fact, she still lives in Jerusalem. She's 87 years old now. And the story that she told me had to do with her experience in 1948, something that she experienced. Now, when I say Jerusalem, I don't mean the old city of Jerusalem. When I say Jerusalem, I mean the communities, the neighborhoods that were built outside in what later on became the Israeli side of Jerusalem. And they were very important, very wealthy Palestinian communities there. And in 1948, the Zionist militia came and they forced the Palestinians out, and they kept the houses and they kept these communities. In fact, those neighborhoods and those houses are still there today. And those houses were made available to Israeli families. Now, my mother was living, she had 2 children, she was living with her parents in a small apartment in Jerusalem, so naturally she was offered one of these homes, and she refused. And when she tells the story, even today, she talks about it with the same passion. She says, how could I possibly take the home of another family? How can I move into the home of another mother that now has to raise her family in a refugee camp or in exile? And then she goes on to describe the looting, the soldiers filling up their trucks. Now, these are well-to-do families, these are well-to-do homes. So they're filling up their trucks with furniture and with rugs. And you may have seen there's a very good documentary about the books that were stolen. The Zionist militia had a unit, a special unit of librarians, and they would go house by house and steal books. And those books are all now in Israel, in libraries in Israel. And there's a very good documentary about the book theft. But it just shows you how organized they were. And she talks about this with such terrible shame. She says, how could we have done this? How could Israelis have done this? How were they not ashamed to go into these homes and treat people like this? And again, she was born and raised in Jerusalem. She knew these neighborhoods. She knew the communities. So she talks about it with great pain. But what's interesting about this story, besides being an excellent story, and we all would hope that we would have behaved like she did, although most people didn't, is that something about it troubled me for many, many years. And it wasn't until I started working on the book and I started talking to her that I understood what was troubling about her story. And the realization I had was that her story is contradicting the national narrative, the Zionist narrative. Because the Zionist narrative is perfect. It has no flaws. And she was presenting a moral dilemma. But how could you present a moral dilemma in a story that is morally perfect? It's so morally perfect that, okay, we deserve the entire country because we are the Jews and this is the land of Israel. So when we came, we deserved the whole thing, but when the United Nations partitioned it, we accepted only a part of it. Then they attacked us and we won. Then we asked the Palestinians to stay and they left. We asked them to stay and they left. So if this is true, and the homes are available because people just left them, and there's a family that needs a home, where's the moral dilemma? There's no moral dilemma in this story. It's perfect. And yet there she was presenting this moral dilemma, nagging with this moral dilemma. And the Zionist history, I'll give you another example, just how perfect the Zionist story is, how foolproof. Even when we do learn as Israelis about atrocities, even then it's morally perfect. For example, there's the famous, or what became famous, the massacre of Dir Yassin. Dir Yassin was a small village on the outskirts of Jerusalem, on the way to Jerusalem. And in 1948, when the Zionist militia came, the village surrendered. And the forces came in and committed a terrible massacre, even though the village surrendered. And hundreds of people were killed, men, women, children. Now, in Israeli schools, we learn about this. And we learn that it was a terrible thing. And it was wrong. Except at the end of the story, we also learn, at the end of that particular story, we are told that as a result of this massacre, hundreds of thousands of Arabs left. And that made it possible for us to create a Jewish majority. And there is nothing more important, nothing more valuable, nothing more moral than to have a Jewish majority in Israel. So even in that context of a terrible massacre, there's a happy ending for us. So it wasn't so bad. So you see, once again, the Zionist narrative is perfect. Even when they drop bombs on civilians in Gaza today, it's morally okay because it's for self-defense. You see? So it's a morally perfect story, but here she was creating this moral dilemma. Like I said, it took many years for me to figure this out. Now, this is what the map looked like. Some of us are old enough to remember when Israel looked like this. So about 80% of the country was included inside Israel, except for the West Bank and Gaza Strip. They were outside of the boundaries of the State of Israel. And in 1967, the opportunity presented itself, and Israel took the remainder of Palestine. It was the 1967 war. I won't go into all the details. I do go into the details in the book. By then, my father was a general, and he was he had a major role in beginning that war. But what we learn is, or what we're told, is that once again in 1967, the Arabs were planning to attack and destroy and kill the Jews. Massive Arab armies were preparing to attack the Jewish state because they wanted to kill the Jews. And once again, these brave Israelis, these brave Jews, these descendants of King David and the Maccabees were able to defeat the Arabs, and this time they did it in 6 days, which again is very biblical, and they were able to conquer the land and prevail. Another thing but when we actually look at the details, we hear, and I did that when I was working on the book, I went into the Israeli Army archives, and the minutes of the meetings of the generals as they're preparing for the war, and you see that they're talking about an opportunity. They're not talking about a threat. There is no threat. They're talking about an opportunity, and they're demanding to be allowed to begin this war. And again, I won't go into all the details. But eventually they do go into the war. They are allowed to start the war, and the rest of the country is taken by Israel. Now, this is a picture of my father. He was already a general by then, like I said. And in fact, most of the young officers from 1948 were by then generals. And they were very young generals. They were in the early 40s to mid-40s, which is very young. And something very interesting happened after the war. Israel conquered the West Bank, it conquered the Golan Heights, it conquered the Sinai, and there was a sense of euphoria and strength and the power that comes with it. And on the very first meeting of the Israeli High Command after the war, he stood up and he said something very interesting. He said, now we need to make peace with the Palestinians. Now we have an opportunity to solve the Palestinian problem. We conquered all this land, we've established ourselves, we're strong, but there are still other people living here, and we still need to work something out. If we make peace with them, allow them to establish a state in the West Bank and Gaza, then we'll be able to make peace with them, and this will be the beginning of a new era. Then we'll be able to make peace with other Arab countries and so on. If we don't do this now, he said, and this is 1967, if we don't do this now, we will become occupiers. They will start a resistance and fight us. The Israeli army will be used to fight this resistance, and this will have terrible moral implications on the Israeli society and the Israeli military. As he was saying these very words, Israel began a massive campaign in the West Bank to destroy cities and towns and villages, push out hundreds of thousands, force hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into exile, and begin a very massive building project for Israeli Jews only in the West Bank, which is exactly what Israel did in other parts of Palestine after 1948. So basically, this is what happened. The entire country became Israel. Palestine was erased off the map completely. And Israel created one state that governs two nations, but has exclusive rights for Jewish people only. And like I said, what they did after 1948, by building only for Israeli Jews, by destroying Palestinian towns, they did in the West Bank after 1967. And one of the very first orders the Israeli military gave after the conquest of the West Bank, one of the very first orders that they gave was that the water sources in the West Bank belong to Israel. The West Bank has huge water sources, a very large mountain aquifer, which is one of the biggest water resources in the entire country. That the water belongs to the land of Israel, to the state of Israel. Now, like I said, they began massive building for Israeli Jews and destroying everything. So in light of that, as we look back at this today, when people say that there's a chance that the state of Israel will allow the Palestinians to establish a state anywhere along those boundaries, it's a complete misunderstanding of what Israel is about. It's a complete misunderstanding of Zionism to think that Israel will ever allow the Palestinians, or anybody else for that matter, to establish a state in these boundaries, within these boundaries. It is an impossibility, because the Zionist ideology is that this is our land, it's the land of Israel. It doesn't belong to the state of Israel. It belongs to the Jewish people. The state of Israel is just the caretaker. And how could you possibly give the land of Israel to somebody else to build a state, to establish a state? And of course, they made it absolutely clear that the integration of the West Bank into the rest of the country was a major national objective. In fact, today there is no West Bank. There is no more West Bank. But again, when they talk about this one state, two state, as though there's some kind of a choice. In 1967, Israel created a single state over all of Palestine, with exclusive rights for Jewish people. And this is how it's going to stay as long as Israel is allowed to continue. Now, the claim that we hear is that the state of Israel wants peace, and they keep trying to make peace, but there's nobody to talk to. The Palestinians are just not interested. Palestinians are just terrorists. Now, my father retired a year after the war from the military, and he continued to pursue these ideas of the need to recognize the rights of Palestinians for self-determination in the West Bank and Gaza so they can establish their own state, and the rights of the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens to equal rights as citizens. Neither of these things has happened yet. In the mid-1970s, he and several other Israelis who thought like him established an organization that was dedicated to Israeli-Palestinian peace. As soon as they created this organization, this was about 1974, 1975, they were contacted by major figures in the PLO leadership, the leadership of the Palestine Liberation Organization, wanting to begin a dialogue on how to establish this, how to make this happen. And they began meetings. They would meet in Paris, they would meet in North Africa, they met in different places. It was all very secret at first. And on the Palestinian side, you had major official figures, ambassadors and Yasser Arafat's top people. And on the Israeli side, you had people who were renegades, people who used to hold high position, they were very respected, but really had no influence at all. Now, this was in the 70s. So they would go, they would meet, and when they would return, and I talk about this again in the book in detail, I remember it vividly. Every time they would return, my father would go and report to the prime minister. So the Israeli cabinet, the Israeli government was fully aware of what was going on. By the way, in this picture, my father is with Issam Sartawi, who was the main guy on the Palestinian side. He was later assassinated. He was the Palestinian ambassador in Paris for many years. So this was in the 70s. In 1983, they met Yasser Arafat in Tunis. It was a highly publicized meeting, and there was the press, and the pictures were there and everything. Shortly after that, Shimon Peres initiated a law that was passed in the Knesset that made these meetings illegal. This is the 80s. Then, suddenly, 1993, there's the Oslo peace process. And many people thought, maybe this is really maybe the beginning of a new era. Apartheid in South Africa was falling apart, the Soviet Union was falling apart, the Berlin Wall was falling, everything was changing, and perhaps there's going to be peace in Palestine. But the reality is that the reason Yitzhak Rabin was agreed to the Oslo peace process is because by 1993, the West Bank was completely integrated into Israel. By 1993, there was no more chance to establish a Palestinian state. The purpose of Oslo was to bring the Palestinians to surrender, to get Yasser Arafat to surrender, which is why it failed. Oslo was supposed to bring to a final solution within 5 years. From 1993, that would be 1998. In the year 2000, as Bill Clinton was leaving office as president, he tried to bring the parties to close the deal. And they met at Camp David, I'm sure some of you remember, and they sat for about 2 weeks and they came out with nothing, no deal. And Bill Clinton said, well, the Palestinians gave some, but the Israelis gave more. In other words, he was blaming the Palestinians for not making concessions. And this is how the world accepted it. And then Yasser Arafat was vilified, and he died 4 years later with Israeli tanks surrounding his office. But the claim that the Palestinians were not willing to make concessions, when we look at the map, under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, the Palestinians were willing to give up 80% of Palestine, recognize the state that destroyed Palestine, give up the right of the refugees to ever return, and make peace with that very state that created this mess, all for peace, all for the future. He was willing to do this if he was able to establish a Palestinian state in all of the West Bank, with East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, all of which is about 22% of Palestine, but not for anything less. And because he was not willing to go for less, because he was not willing to surrender completely, he was vilified. And the reality is, the truth of the matter is that Yasser Arafat was the most consistent voice for peace in the Middle East for 3 decades. Between the mid-1970s until the day he died in 2004, he was completely dedicated to the idea of peace based on the two-state solution. Completely consistent, and he wouldn't go beyond it. Israel, on the other hand, has shown absolutely no sign that it's interested in peace, quite the opposite. At every possible moment, at every possible opportunity, they destroy the chances for any negotiated agreement with the Palestinians. And of course, we know that it builds cities and towns and highways and shopping malls and everything else in the West Bank for Israelis only. So the claim that Israel wants peace is absolutely absurd when we talk about the issue of Palestine. Now, one topic that is often ignored in regards to the Israeli-Palestinian issue is the issue of the Palestinian prisoners. Israel likes to call itself a democracy, but if you're a democracy, why do you have thousands and thousands of political prisoners? So the answer Israel has is, well, they're terrorists. The problem with that answer is that the vast majority of Palestinian prisoners have not been charged with acts of violence. Even the state of Israel, with its very low bar when it comes to judging Palestinians, could not charge these people with violence. The vast majority of the prisoners have not been charged with violence. They are political prisoners. I believe only less than 10% of the prisoner population have actually been charged with acts of violence. And we have hundreds of Palestinian prisoners who have not been charged with anything. They're under administrative arrest. So even the Israeli judicial system could find nothing with which to charge them. And still they're in prison, sometimes for years. Many of them have been on a hunger strike for a very long time because of this. These are political prisoners. And they say that Palestinians are one of the most incarcerated people in the world. If you've been there, and I'm sure, how many people here have been to Palestine? Can I see a show of hands? Yeah, okay, good. That's what I thought. Almost every Palestinian family you meet either has somebody in prison or had somebody in prison. And the Palestinian prisoners are an important part of the social and political life within Palestine. Palestinians regard their time in prison with, like a badge of honor. They know that they are freedom fighters. Now, besides all of that, the world community, the international community, recognizes the rights of people to resist. This is the United Nations resolution. The struggle of people under colonial and alien domination and racist regimes for the implementation of the right to independence is in full accordance with the principles of international law. It is legal. Resistance is legal. The world community decided that people under oppression, under oppressive regimes, and under occupation have the rights to resist. I remember one time my father, he was already a retired general, and he was asked as a retired general, how do you speak to terrorists? How can you possibly negotiate with terrorists? And he said, well, terrorism is a terrible thing. At the same time, when a small nation is overpowered by a larger power, by a larger nation, Quite often, terrorism is the only means at their disposal. If we don't like the terrorism, we need to stop the oppression. If we don't like the resistance, the power is in the hands of the stronger of the two parties. If Israel doesn't like rockets coming out of Gaza, they can lift the siege and free the people of Gaza. We can't oppress people and then ask them to shut up, sit down and be quiet and not resist. I mean, we can ask them, it's not going to work. And the vast majority of Palestinian resistance, as is reflected in the Palestinian prisoner population, has been unarmed resistance. The vast majority of Palestinian resistance has not been violent. It's been nonviolent resistance. And of course, this goes on to this day. The resistance goes on, and the vast majority of it is not violent. And again, this is one issue that is quite often overlooked as we talk about this. But Israel has the ability to call itself a democracy, even though it holds thousands of political prisoners, and it's time to call it, if nothing else, to release release political prisoners. And then, of course, the price that is paid is always with the lives of innocent civilians. And in the story, in the experience of my family, it was my sister's little girl, Smadar, who was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem. It was September 1997. School had just started. She went downtown Jerusalem with friends to buy some things, and two young Palestinians blew themselves up. They died, of course, and 5 or 6 Israelis were killed as well, including Smadar. Like I said, she was 13 years old. Now, I was living in the US at the time, so when I heard, I took the first plane home and went back to Jerusalem. And by the time I went to my sister's apartment, it was full of reporters. And of course, with people who came to mourn, both Palestinians and Israelis. Now, a violent attack like that is always big news in Israel. This was bigger news because one of the victims was the granddaughter of a famous general. And this general also made a name for himself as being an advocate for Palestinian rights. And the questions that come up, or that came up, are always the same questions. What about retaliation and revenge? How do we punish them? How many do we kill? How do we find who's responsible, and so on? And my sister Nurit, after the funeral, finally came out to speak to everyone. And about the retaliation and revenge, the first thing she said was, no real mother would want to see this happen to any other mother. To kill people in response to the death of somebody, particularly a child, is reprehensible and absurd. And she said, what would a real mother would want to see such horrible grief happen to another mother? And she quoted a line from a famous Hebrew poet, Bialik, who wrote that even the devil himself couldn't come up with a vengeance that's appropriate for the death of a child. What do? Kill 1,000 people, 10,000 people, 1,000,000 people? Will it bring her back? And in terms of who's responsible, both she and her husband said, we hold the Israeli government directly responsible for our daughter's death. Because it is the policies of the State of Israel that brought to this. Because when you steal people's land and destroy their homes and take their water and arrest their fathers and shoot their brothers and sisters in their schools where they're helpless, what do we expect? As a society, as a state, what do we expect? And people talk in terms of forgiveness and that sort of thing. And forgiveness is a completely wrong attitude here. There has to be justice. Israeli politicians, Israeli commanders, Israeli generals all have to face justice. All have to be brought to trial. Forgiving and forgetting is completely the wrong, in my opinion at least, completely the wrong way to go. They should not be forgiven. And one of the things Nurit says to this day is, the people that killed my daughter are dead. But the perpetrators of the crimes and murders against Palestinians are free and will do it again and again. So I think the call for justice is very important, as opposed to forgiving and forgetting is a personal issue. In terms of my life, I had to, after this was over, I had to go back and pick up my life back in Israel, in the US. And it's not an easy thing to do after something like this. You can't just brush it off. It's a horrible experience. But I was very fortunate because in San Diego, I found a Jewish Palestinian group that was meeting and talking on a regular basis. And I decided to participate, and I talk about this again in the book quite in detail. And this is the very first time that I ever met Palestinians. Now, I was born and raised in Jerusalem, which is a mixed city. And the chapter in the book that talks about the beginning of this journey of mine starts with a line, "My journey into Palestine began in San Diego when I was 39 years old." And not only was it the first time that I met Palestinians, it's the first time that I was with Palestinians and we were equal. We got the same amounts of water. We lived under the same laws. They had no restrictions, they needed no permits, there were no checkpoints. We would all come, we would all talk, we would all go, and we were completely equal. And that does not exist at all in that country. It doesn't exist in Jerusalem, it doesn't exist in Jaffa, it doesn't exist in Tel Aviv, it doesn't exist in the West Bank, it doesn't exist in Gaza, it doesn't exist in the Negev. It does not exist anywhere in that country where there's equality between Israelis and Palestinians. And thanks to this Palestinian community that I met in San Diego, I was able to go through this very difficult process of learning that there's a whole other narrative, there's a whole other story that I was not familiar with. And that it's okay to have two stories, and they could both live side by side. But then go through this next step, which is even more painful, more difficult, and realizing that only one of the stories is true, and it's not the story that I know. And that's like having your arm cut off very slowly with no anesthesia. It's physically painful. But what's interesting is when you go through a process like this, I think probably the most dangerous thing that happens is that the fear starts leaving and the trust comes and takes its place. And then when trust replaces the fear, then the boundaries fall and the walls fall, and suddenly you don't see Palestinians, you don't see enemies, you just see people. And that's a very dangerous process because you suddenly realize that we're all people. And you can't hold on to these boundaries and to these divisions between people. And so I suddenly realized there was a whole country that I never knew, even though I was born and raised there, and it's called Palestine. And there are people that were my neighbors that I never met, and they are the Palestinians. And there's an entire culture that I was never aware of, even though it was happening right outside my door. Because the country is so segregated. And then I began traveling into Palestinian communities, both in the West Bank and other parts of the country, and kind of familiarizing myself with the Palestinian issue and with the Palestinian story and with the Palestinian experience. Now, the last chapter of the book talks about, the title is One State, Two State, Three States, and it talks about this issue. And it's actually a conversation where I'm discussing this issue with someone. And what's I think important to realize is the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian issue is has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with values. It's not a political issue. Because there are only two choices. Accepting the reality that exists today is one choice, and that is that today there is a single state over all of Palestine. It's a binational state. You've got Israelis and Palestinians with exclusive rights for Jewish people. There are laws that govern the lives of Israelis like myself. We live in a democracy. I can come, I can go, I can buy a house, I can get a job, I can say what I want. Then there are the laws that govern the lives of Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. And there are dozens of laws in the Israeli law books that specifically discriminate against the Palestinian citizens of Israel. You can go to adallah.org and you can see all those laws. They're written down, they're online. They're all available to see. And they live in an entire environment of neglect and discrimination. They don't need laws in order for Israelis to treat them with this discrimination. It's a culture of discrimination. communities that are not connected to water, communities that are not connected to electricity, communities, their lands are being squeezed away from them. You'd be hard-pressed to find a single permit ever given or a single dollar ever invested in Palestinian communities inside Israel. As communities for Israeli Jews are being built and highways are being built and all this. And then you've got the Palestinians who live in what used to be the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And there are no laws that protect them at all. They are at the mercy of the Israeli military. And the Israeli military has no mercy. They're living under military law, and the Israeli military today is probably one of the best funded, one of the best armed, one of the best trained terrorist organizations in the world. They have commanders, and they have uniforms, and they have F-16s, and they have tanks, but they are nothing more than a glorified terrorist organization. They are dedicated entirely to terrorizing the Palestinian people. And when an Israeli army commander comes to Europe, they should be stopped and arrested immediately, as opposed to being paraded and heralded as VIPs. They should be afraid to get off the plane. And if they do get off the plane, they need to find their way immediately to the International Criminal Court. But this is the reality in which Palestinians live today. That was a little side note. This is the reality that exists today. And if we support the idea of the State of Israel, and if we support the idea of a Jewish state, and if we support the idea of Zionism, then this is it. It's a package deal. There is no other option. There is no other version of Zionism. There are all these organizations in America. There's J Street, and I'm sure there are other organizations in Europe that try to create the impression that, well, we can have this nicer version of Zionism. Well, there is no nicer version of racism. Racism is racism. There's no degrees of racism. It's like pregnancy. If you're pregnant, you're pregnant. If you're a racist, you're racist. You can't be a little racist. So that's the option. And if people support the State of Israel, and this is their value, and this works for their values, or this works for their religious belief, then that's their choice. But there is another option. There is another option. When people thought that apartheid in South Africa, that racism against blacks in South Africa was wrong, people all over the world stood up and fought apartheid. And apartheid fell. And this is one example of many. In my lifetime, I'm only 51, but in my lifetime we've seen many regimes fall, many non-democratic racist regimes fall, and without violence. So there is another option. If we are not willing to accept the oppression and the terrorizing of Palestinians by Israel, then we need to stand up and speak against Zionism, just like people spoke against apartheid, because they're both the same. Not exactly the same, each one has its own characteristics. But the State of Israel is a racist state. The whole idea of a Jewish state is a racist, quite absurd idea. Because you cannot have a Jewish state in an Arab country where half the population is not Jewish, unless it comes with that entire package of violence and racism. The reality is that half the population is not Jewish, so it's not a Jewish state. And it's not a democracy either, because the democracy only applies to the Jews. The non-Jews do not live in a democracy. But since it is one state, everybody is governed by the same government, it's not a democracy. So does this mean the end of the Jewish state? Absolutely. Does this mean genocide? No. Does this mean a Holocaust? No. It means including everybody in the process that's already there. It means recognizing that there is a state there, that's a binational state, and you have two communities that need to live as equals. Because this is the right thing to do, and it's the only thing to do. You have 6 million Palestinians today and about 6.5 million Israelis. In the next 5 to 7 years, there will be more Palestinians than Israelis. In fact, in Gaza alone, there's going to be another 500,000 people in the next 5 years. So are they still going to live and rely on tunnels to bring in water and food and medicine? It's an absurd proposition. Now, I think this is a good outcome. This is going to be a good outcome for Israelis and for Palestinians. Israelis and Palestinians are very similar societies. They're both highly educated. They both have traditions of democracy. They both have very corrupt leaders that they want to get rid of. They all have their own little groups of fanatics that they want to get rid of. Most Israelis and most Palestinians are educated people who live somewhere in the middle, economically and otherwise. Even in Gaza, with all the harsh conditions and it being really an open-air prison, even there today, literacy rates are over 90%, some of the highest in the world. So what we need is not a solution that's going to partition them, because you can't partition them. The two communities are very close together. They're segregated, but they're very close together. And there are areas where they're already working together because they have to. Israeli hospitals need doctors. Palestinians are excellent doctors. You've got doctors and nurses in Israeli hospitals everywhere. Even in Israeli hospitals in the cities in the West Bank, you have Palestinian doctors. But the problem is that these doctors, if they have to go to a convention or they have to go overseas and they have to go through the Tel Aviv airport, they go through hours of humiliation and terrorizing by these young Israeli terrorists, security guards, who treat them like criminals for hours. So that cannot be sustained. And the demographic change cannot be sustained. So like I said, we've seen this happen in the past. We've seen racist regimes, we've seen dictatorial regimes fall, and without violence, quite often. We've seen people around the world get up and resist and force their governments to stop supporting countries that were like that. That's what people in Europe need to do. That's what people in America are doing. In fact, Europe is probably ahead of America in this regard, but there have been big changes over the last 5-6 years. So it's a hard thing to say, we need to stop, we need to change, we need to cancel this idea of a Jewish state, but that's exactly what needs to happen, because it's not a Jewish state anyway. There's nothing anti-Semitic about it. And I would suggest that anybody who does believe in justice and does believe in peace, and whose values do point toward democracy and equal rights and respect for people's human rights and civil rights, line up behind the banner of a real democracy, a democracy with equal rights. That is exactly, I think, how it's going to turn out. And the sooner we get behind this banner and the harder we work, the faster it's going to be. And the better it will be for everyone. So I saw that many of you were there. You've seen what a beautiful country it is. You've seen the tremendous potential, both in the people and the country. The missing link is the equal rights. And this link, these equal rights, once they are established, will allow Israelis and Palestinians to establish a functioning, productive democracy very, very quickly. And then there will be they'll be able to meet the potential of the country and of the people. So a democracy with equal rights for everybody is the thing to do, and that's the struggle we need to be behind. Thank you very much.